What if everything you believed about 19th century manners turned out to be a complete lie? The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the incredible strictness of every daily activity in London society. Modern movies show us light flirting at balls and pleasant strolls, but the reality was far harsher and even frightening. Believe me, if you found yourself in a Victorian drawing room, you would feel like you were in a minefield, where any mistake leads to a social explosion. People of that era lived within an invisible framework of the strictest rules and codes of conduct that governed literally every breath. Every movement of the hand or tilt of the head was evaluated by those around them on a complex scale of social propriety. You can't even imagine how meticulously every gesture was prescribed, from how you hold a teacup to the angle at which you look at your conversation partner. One wrong move, and you became an outcast whom no one wanted to associate with. In this video guide to surviving the 19th century, we'll reveal the secrets that helped aristocrats save face in the most absurd situations. How to enter a room properly so as not to offend the hosts, and why a simple greeting could turn into a complex diplomatic ritual. We'll show you the behind the scenes of this glamorous life, where every smile hid cold calculation and fear of public censure. Watch the video all the way to the end, and you'll learn how a simple tilt of a fan could permanently ruin a person's reputation in high society. This is no joke and no exaggeration. There was an entire secret language of objects, closely watched by hundreds of eyes. We'll reveal the secret code that determined the fate of entire dynasties and ruined lives because of a single small misstep. Get ready, because after this, you'll realize that the rules of etiquette were a real weapon in the hands of the elite. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian aristocratic social interaction. The primary means of communication at that time was a small rectangle of thick white cardstock bearing the owner's printed name. A calling card served as a literal pass into the drawing rooms of influential figures and determined a person's social status. The process of exchanging these paper rectangles was governed by a vast number of unspoken laws and strict regulations. The slightest error in font size or paper quality instantly gave away a person of humble origins. The proper time for paying visits was subject to strict time limits. It was customary to leave a card exclusively during the hours of so-called morning visits. The name of these visits was misleading, since they always took place in the afternoon between 3 and 5 o'clock. They were called morning visits only because they took place before the official evening meal. Violating this time frame was considered a gross breach of etiquette and a sign of bad taste. The very process of handing over the card required knowledge of many subtleties. The guest handed his cardboard pass to the servant at the front door and waited silently for the host's verdict. A folded upper right corner of the card signified the person's personal presence at the doorstep. If the corner remained straight, it indicated that the card had been delivered by the visitor's servant. The host carefully examined these details before deciding whether to receive the guest. The number of cards left depended on the composition of the host's household. A married man always left 2 of his own cards and 1 card from his wife. 1 card was intended for the host, and the second was given to the hostess. Women were strictly forbidden from leaving their calling cards with unmarried men. This complex arithmetic required constant attention and a good memory from every socialite. The design of the cards themselves adhered to conservative standards. Thick white cardstock had to have perfectly straight edges, without any gold embossing. The owner's name was printed in a simple black font, without any unnecessary decorative flourishes or embellishments. The use of colored cardstock or elaborate coats of arms was considered a sign of vulgarity and bad taste. The simpler and more austere the card looked, the higher the owner's social status was regarded. The card system allowed people to maintain contact from a distance without meeting in person. A card left behind required a mandatory response in the form of a return visit within 1 week. The absence of a return card served as a clear signal to cease all communication. People used this method to quietly and amicably sever unwanted social ties. A simple rectangular piece of paper replaced lengthy explanations and unpleasant conversations. Special pencil markings on the cards added new layers of meaning to the communication. Letters in the lower corner could signify congratulations, condolences, or a farewell before a long departure. These abbreviations were written strictly in French, which was considered the language of international diplomacy. Deciphering these abbreviations was an essential part of every socialite's upbringing. Ignorance of such subtleties closed the doors to many prestigious homes in the capital. Violating any of these unspoken rules led to immediate exclusion from the list of welcome guests. A person was deprived of the opportunity to attend social events and lost all their valuable social connections. The strictness of card etiquette maintained clear boundaries between the different strata of the city's population. It would be very interesting to hear your perspective on such rules. What do you think about this complex system of passes? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how a simple piece of fabric replaced a full-fledged conversation for people? Under strict social restrictions, women used accessories to convey hidden messages. A simple summer parasol served not only as protection from the sun's rays, but also as a tool for silent communication. Every movement of this object in a lady's hands carried a specific coded meaning. Those around her watched these gestures closely to understand her mood. Slowly twirling the parasol in her hands signaled boredom and a desire to end the current conversation. If the parasol rested on her right shoulder, it meant she was open to light flirtation and continuing the conversation. Moving the parasol to the left shoulder signaled that the lady wished to be left alone. Dropping this wooden or bone object sharply to the ground served as a signal of a categorical refusal to the conversation partner. Gentlemen were obliged to notice these signs and react to them immediately in an appropriate manner. The fan was an even more complex and multifaceted tool of social interaction. This object was made of silk, lace, and thin bone or wooden slats. Rapid, nervous fanning with a fan indicated a woman's extreme irritation or dissatisfaction. A slow, smooth movement of an open fan conveyed calmness and favor toward the conversation partner. A closed fan pressed to the heart expressed deep affection and sincere sympathy. The position of the fan relative to the face played a key role in conveying information. Placing a closed fan against the right cheek signified agreement with the speaker's opinion. The same gesture against the left cheek expressed categorical disagreement and refusal. Running the fan across the eyes served as a warning that someone was watching the couple closely. Each such movement was practiced in front of a mirror until it became second nature. The material and color of the accessories strictly corresponded to the time of day and the nature of the event. Morning fans were made of thick cotton in light shades with minimal decoration. Evening fans were adorned with intricate embroidery, feathers, and mother-of-pearl inlays on the handles. Using a luxurious evening fan during a daytime stroll was considered a sign of poor taste. Choosing the right item was just as important as knowing how to use it. Handing a fan to another person in the room was considered a sign of utmost trust. Dropping a fan on the floor signified a demonstration of complete submission and agreement with the interlocutor's opinion. If the fan accidentally fell, the gentleman nearby was required to immediately pick it up and return it to its owner. However, the man was not permitted to open someone else's fan or examine its patterns. The fan was returned with a slight bow and without unnecessary words. Knowledge of the language of accessories was considered just as essential a discipline as playing the piano or embroidery. Without these skills, a successful debut in London society was absolutely impossible. Accessories literally spoke for people in rooms where strict censorship of open emotions reigned. This complex system of signs allowed people to circumvent strict prohibitions on displaying emotions in public places. People could carry on entire conversations right under the noses of strict guardians of morality while remaining unnoticed. This invisible exchange of messages added excitement to boring and lengthy social gatherings. Do you think modern people could remember so many meanings for a single object? In the next chapter, you'll learn how the arrangement of chairs determined the fate of noble dynasties. What I am about to reveal was hidden behind the massive oak doors of the dining halls of the Victorian aristocracy. Organizing a formal dinner was a highly complex strategic task for the hostess. Every chair at the long mahogany table had its own precise social weight significance. A mistake in seating the guests was taken as a personal insult and could lead to years of enmity between families. Protocol demanded impeccable knowledge of the status, titles, and family ties of every invited guest. Punctuality upon arrival at such a dinner was the strictest and most unbreakable rule. Guests were required to cross the threshold of the house exactly 15 minutes before the meal was served. Being even 5 minutes late was considered an unforgivable lack of respect for the assembled company. Arriving before the appointed time was also frowned upon, as it might catch the hostess off guard. Punctuality demonstrated one's level of refinement and respect for others' time. The procession from the parlor to the dining room resembled a carefully rehearsed theatrical entrance. The host always offered his right arm to the most distinguished lady among the guests present. The lady of the house brought up the rear of the procession, leaning on the arm of the most senior gentleman. The other guests lined up in pairs strictly according to their social standing. This slow procession through the corridors of the house took place in absolute and solemn silence. Seats at the table were assigned with mathematical precision according to an invisible hierarchy. Guests of honor were always seated to the right of the host and hostess, respectively. Less distinguished guests were seated closer to the center of the long rectangular table. Men and women alternated to ensure the proper balance for maintaining small talk. Married couples were never seated next to each other to encourage interaction with others. The rules for handling glass goblets were no less strict and detailed. A heavy crystal goblet was to be held exclusively by its slender stem. Touching the bowl of the glass with one's fingers left marks on the glass and warmed the drink, which was considered unacceptable. One was permitted to drink only after carefully dabbing one's lips with a linen napkin. This was done to ensure that not even the slightest trace of grease remained on the transparent rim of the crystal. Topics for table conversation were subject to the strictest internal censorship by each guest. Politics, religion, and financial matters were strictly forbidden at the dinner table. The ideal conversation consisted of discussions about theater premieres, new literary releases, or the weather. Loud laughter or overly emotional arguments were immediately quashed by the cold stares of those around them. The conversation was meant to resemble a light game of catch, where every participant had an equal say. The end of dinner was marked by yet another strict gender division in society. The hostess gave a barely perceptible nod to the guest of honor, after which all the women rose from the table. The ladies left the dining room and retired to the parlor for conversation and embroidery. The men remained at the table to smoke cigars and discuss serious matters in strictly male company. If you like this complex system of organizing dinners, be sure to like this video.
Must be exaggerating the details, surely.
The secret that people pay thousands for lies in the art of moving correctly through the city streets. A morning stroll through the streets of London was not a leisurely activity, but a complex social ritual. The sidewalks turned into a veritable stage, where every passerby played a strictly defined role. Walking speed, the direction of one's gaze, and the position of one's hands were strictly controlled by social norms. A simple outing required careful preparation and knowledge of all the rules of street etiquette. The time for walks was chosen with particular care, depending on the status of the neighborhood. High society preferred to appear on the paths of Hyde Park strictly between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. At this time, one could meet the right acquaintances on the paths and show off new outfits. Walks at later hours were considered the preserve of merchants and the working class. Early morning was also frowned upon, as the streets were being cleaned of debris during that time. The system of greetings on the street was based on a strict hierarchy of status and gender. A woman always had the exclusive right to be the first to acknowledge a man walking toward her. She would signal this with a slight nod of the head or a barely perceptible smile. Only then was the gentleman permitted to tip his top hat in return. If the lady chose to look straight ahead, the man was obliged to pass by without showing any sign of recognition. Carrying packages and purchases on the street was strictly forbidden for members of the upper class. All purchased goods were to be delivered by couriers directly to the buyer's doorstep. A gentleman appearing on the street with a large box in his hands immediately relegated him to the rank of a shop assistant. Even small packages were hidden in coat pockets or handed to servants walking behind. Free hands demonstrated a person's independence from physical labor. Stopping to talk in the middle of a busy sidewalk was considered extremely rude. If acquaintances wished to exchange a few words, they had to step to the side of the road. The conversation could not last longer than 2 or 3 minutes, so as not to attract the attention of passers-by. Loud greetings or embraces on the street were absolutely out of the question for respectable people. Any display of intense emotion was equated with a public scandal. Escorting a lady across the street required a gentleman to perform complex maneuvers. The man always positioned himself on the side of the roadway to protect his companion's dress from the mud kicked up by passing carriages. When crossing the street, he had to step slightly ahead to assess the safety of the path. Touching a lady's hand without her explicit permission was strictly forbidden, even for safety's sake. Assistance was offered exclusively by extending a bent elbow forward. The proper way to view shop windows was also governed by rules of etiquette. One was permitted to glance at the merchandise through the glass only briefly, without pausing one's stride. Standing in front of a window display for too long marked a person as an idle onlooker or a foreign tourist. Pointing at items with a finger or discussing them aloud with a companion was considered the height of impropriety. A respectable person always knew exactly where they were going and why. Returning home brought this complex street spectacle, stretching several blocks to a close. Servants at the door collected canes, top hats, and wet umbrellas, ushering their masters back into the safe confines of the home. Street dust was carefully brushed off with special brushes before entering the main rooms. Do you follow similar rules when you go for a walk today? In the next chapter, you will learn how formal introductions took place in the 19th century. The formal introduction of two people to one another was the foundation of the entire Victorian social system. Without a proper introduction, interaction between strangers in high society was categorically impossible. Speaking to someone at a reception without a prior introduction was considered unthinkable audacity. This strict barrier protected respectable citizens from contact with undesirable elements of society. The role of mediator during an introduction was always taken on by a mutual acquaintance with an impeccable reputation. The rules of introduction were based on strict adherence to social and gender hierarchies. A person of lower status was always introduced to a person of higher standing. A gentleman was always introduced to a lady, regardless of his title or financial standing. Young people were introduced to older members of society as a sign of respect for their life experience. The name of the more prominent person was always spoken first in the introduction. The first words spoken after a formal introduction were also strictly governed by rules of tone. The conversation was always initiated by the person of higher status, setting the tone for the ensuing exchange. This was typically a neutral comment about the weather, the quality of the music in the hall, or the beauty of the floral arrangements. Asking personal questions or attempting to joke during the first conversation was considered a sign of poor upbringing. The conversation was meant to remain superficial, polite, and as safe as possible for both parties. Introduction letters were used for making acquaintances in other cities or countries. Such a letter was written by a mutual acquaintance and given to the traveler in an unsealed envelope. Sealing a letter of recommendation was considered an insult, as it implied that the sender was keeping a secret from the recipient. The person would leave this letter along with their calling card at the home of the intended recipient. A personal meeting would take place only after the host had read the letter and scheduled a time for the visit. Making acquaintances at crowded balls had its own specific characteristics and limitations. The introduction of a dance partner was valid only within the ballroom and for that one evening. The next day on the street, dance partners were once again considered complete strangers. To continue their interaction, a new, more formal introduction during the day was required. This system protected ladies from the intrusive attention of random suitors from the dance floor. If the introduction took place in a carriage during a park stroll, the rules changed. None of the passengers were to leave their seats to perform the bowing ceremony. The introduction took place while seated, using expressive glances and slight nods of the head. The sound of the wheels drowned out the loud pronouncing of names, so the participants tried to articulate as clearly as possible. After exchanging a few brief remarks, the carriages drove off in different directions. Particular delicacy was required when introducing people with the same surnames. The intermediary was obliged to clearly pronounce titles, ranks, or places of residence to avoid confusion. In cases involving noble titles, the full and correct forms of address had to be used. A mistake in the title of a lord or earl could cost the matchmaker his reputation in high society. Precision of wording was valued just as highly as elegance of manners. A successful introduction imposed certain obligations on all three participants in the process. The introducer bore moral responsibility for the future conduct of the person they had introduced. If the new acquaintance committed an improper act, a shadow fell upon the one who had recommended them. A proper introduction opened the doors to high society and provided the person with reliable connections. What if everything you were taught about correspondence became obsolete 200 years ago? Writing letters in the Victorian era was a true art form with its own strict rules. The quality of the paper, the color of the ink, and the way the sheet was folded said more about a person than the words themselves. Written communication replaced phone calls and required a tremendous amount of time and attention. The slightest carelessness in the design of the envelope was perceived as a deliberate insult to the recipient. Choosing the right paper was the first and most crucial step in composing a letter. People of standing used only thick, slightly rough paper with watermarks. Thin or cheap paper was considered the lot of the poor and commercial clerks. The use of lined sheets was strictly forbidden in the private correspondence of high society under any circumstances. One had to be able to write in perfectly straight lines on the blank white space of the sheet. The color of ink and sealing wax was also strictly regulated, depending on the purpose of the letter. For everyday correspondence, only classic black or dark blue ink was used. Red sealing wax was used exclusively for business letters and official documents. Green or blue wax was used for friendly messages or romantic correspondence. A mistake in choosing the color of the seal could distort the meaning of the entire letter, even before it was opened. Cross-writing was a unique invention of that era, designed to save paper and reduce postage costs. Postage rates depended on the number of sheets, so people would fill a page with text horizontally and then write new lines vertically over them. Reading such a grid of ink required immense patience and good eyesight. However, in correspondence with people of high status, this method was strictly forbidden. They were expected to write on only one side of the sheet, demonstrating respect and generosity. The way a sheet of paper was folded before being placed in an envelope also mattered. The edges of the paper had to align with perfect geometric precision without any creases. A letter folded unevenly betrayed the sender's haste or nervousness. Envelopes were sealed with melted sealing wax, upon which the owner's personal name seal was placed. A smudged or crooked wax impression indicated a person's carelessness and poor upbringing. Special rules applied when writing letters to members of the opposite sex. Unmarried ladies were not permitted to be the first to write letters to gentlemen who were not relatives. Correspondence between young people was permitted only after an official engagement and parental approval. All letters were carefully reviewed by older family members before being sent or read. This strict censorship ensured the preservation of the impeccable reputation of all members of a noble family. The use of postage stamps introduced new nuances into the system of written etiquette. The stamp had to be affixed strictly in the upper right corner of the envelope, perfectly aligned with the edges. A stamp affixed upside down could be interpreted as a secret sign or an insult to the postal service. Letters were always sent with postage prepaid by the sender. Making the recipient pay for delivery was considered the height of impropriety and stinginess. The ability to write elegant letters was an essential skill for a successful life in society. Calligraphic handwriting and eloquent speech opened doors to the finest homes in the capital. Handwritten pages were carefully stored in wooden boxes as mementos of important social connections. How often do you write letters by hand these days? In the next chapter, you'll learn why Victorians never left the house empty-handed. Wearing gloves in the 19th century went far beyond simply protecting one's hands from the cold. This item of clothing became the primary symbol of belonging to the leisure class, free from physical labor. Going out with bare hands was considered just as shameful as going out without shoes. Impeccably clean gloves served as visible proof that a person did not engage in menial labor. The slightest stain on the delicate leather could permanently ruin a gentleman's reputation.
I simply cannot believe it.
The material and color of gloves were strictly regulated depending on the time of day and the occasion. For morning walks and visits, gloves made of thick leather in shades of gray or yellowish tones were used. Evening balls required exclusively white gloves made of the finest kid leather. This leather was so delicate that the gloves often tore at the very first attempt to put them on. That is why men always brought several spare pairs with them to evening events. The process of putting on this accessory required privacy and time. Pulling on gloves on the go or in public was considered a sign of poor manners. A gentleman or lady had to tidy their hands before leaving their private quarters. The thin leather fit snugly around each finger, requiring the careful fastening of numerous small buttons at the wrist. Removing gloves in public was permitted only in strictly defined situations. One such situation was a dinner party at a respectable home. Gloves were removed immediately before guests sat down at the mahogany dining table. Sitting at the table while wearing gloves was unacceptable as it hindered the proper use of cutlery. The removed gloves were neatly folded and tucked into pockets or under a napkin on the lap. Immediately after the meal ended and the guests moved to the parlor, the gloves were to be put back on. The rules for handshakes while wearing gloves constituted a complex system of social compromises. According to etiquette, a man was required to remove the glove from his right hand before shaking a lady's hand. If he could not remove the glove quickly, the gentleman was obliged to apologize for shaking hands with his gloved hand. Ladies, on the other hand, never removed their gloves for greetings on the street or in the ballroom. Their hands were to remain hidden from prying eyes under all circumstances. At balls, white kid gloves served a specific hygienic and social function. Touching a dance partner's dress with hands damp from sweat was considered absolutely unacceptable. The thin leather of the gloves served as a reliable barrier during the waltz or quadrille. If a gentleman's gloves became soiled or wet during the dance, he was obliged to immediately leave the ballroom and change into a new pair. Dirty gloves at a ball were equated with a public insult to the entire society. Purchasing this wardrobe item accounted for a significant portion of a socialite's expenses. True dandies ordered gloves from different craftsmen. Some sewed the fingers, others designed the wrist area. It was considered normal to discard gloves after a single use if the slightest creases appeared on them. The ability to constantly wear new, perfectly fitting gloves underscored the owner's wealth and status. Skimping on this wardrobe item quickly became a subject of ridicule in clubs. Women's gloves were even more complex in design and varied in length. Daytime models covered only the hand and fastened with 2 or 3 buttons at the wrist. Evening ball gloves reached the elbow or even higher, fitting snugly around the arm. Putting on such long styles required the help of maids and special bone hooks for the buttons. The combination of long white gloves and a deep neckline created the socially accepted image of evening elegance. The accidental loss of a single glove was a true disaster for etiquette. Left with only one gloved hand, a person could not continue visiting or remain in society. They had to return home immediately or go to a shop for a new pair. A found glove was never returned to its owner in person, but was passed on through a servant. This small leather item wielded enormous power over the daily routine of London's elite. Evening balls represented the pinnacle of social activity in Victorian society. Organizing such events required enormous financial expenditure and the strictest adherence to protocol. The ballroom was decorated with flowers, mirrors, and thousands of wax candles and crystal chandeliers. A special gallery was built for the orchestra so that the musicians would not mingle with the dancing guests. Every detail of the interior emphasized the solemnity and exclusivity of the event. The main document at such an evening was the ball book, or carnet. This small book, with a tiny pencil attached to it, was handed to each lady upon entering the hall. In it were recorded the names of the gentlemen who had previously engaged the lady for specific dances. Promising the same dance to two different men was considered a gross violation of the rules. Losing the dance card led to confusion and serious conflicts among the gentlemen wishing to dance. The process of asking a lady to dance was accompanied by strict formalities and bows. The gentleman would approach the lady, make a deep bow, and politely ask her to do him the honor of being his partner. If a lady refused one gentleman, citing fatigue, she was not permitted to dance that dance with another. Acceptance was accompanied by the handing over of the dance card to record the name of the suitor. All these actions took place under the watchful eye of strict chaperones and older female relatives. For a long time, the waltz was considered a highly controversial and even scandalous dance in conservative society. Unlike the quadrille, where partners only lightly touched hands, the waltz required closer contact. The position of the hands during the waltz was strictly controlled. The gentleman's right hand was to only lightly support the lady's waist. The distance between the dancers had to remain large enough for a person to pass between them. Any reduction of this distance was immediately met with disapproving glances from the older generation. Conversation during the dance was limited to light, meaningless phrases. Discussing serious topics, thereby disrupting the rhythm of the music, was considered a sign of poor dancing ability. The gentleman was expected to fully control the couple's movement across the dance floor, avoiding collisions with other dancers. The ability to glide smoothly across the waxed parquet floor while maintaining small talk required years of practice. A misstep or an accidental fall to the floor became a source of ridicule for months. When the music ended, the gentleman was obliged to offer the lady his right arm and escort her to a place to rest. Leaving a lady alone in the middle of the dance floor was an absolutely unacceptable act. After escorting his partner to her seat, the gentleman would take a final bow and withdraw. Often after a quick dance, the gentleman would offer to bring some refreshments or lemonade. This provided an opportunity to continue the conversation for a few minutes in a more relaxed setting. Dancing more than 3 dances in an evening with the same partner was considered improper. Such behavior was viewed as a public announcement of an engagement or as evidence of the lady's frivolity. The purpose of the ball was to facilitate as many social interactions as possible between different families. Constantly changing partners ensured that none of the guests would be left out. The hostess of the ball carefully ensured that everyone present took part in the dancing. If a gentleman arrived at the ball without a partner, he was obliged to dance with the ladies designated by the hostess. Refusing such a request was considered a personal insult to the evening's organizers. Men often had to dance with the host's elderly female relatives out of a sense of duty. This was an unspoken price to pay for the privilege of attending a prestigious event and enjoying an exquisite dinner. Shirking these duties by retreating to the card room was frowned upon by society. The behavior of unmarried young women at the ball was monitored with particular care. They were not allowed to move about the hall without being accompanied by an older female relative or a married lady. Laughing too loudly or gesturing too animatedly while conversing with gentlemen was forbidden. A young woman was expected to demonstrate modesty, grace, and complete submission to the will of her elders. The ball was a sort of Vanity Fair where the fates of future marriages were decided. The conclusion of the ball was also governed by its own unspoken rules of etiquette. Guests were not to leave the house until the most distinguished guests of the evening had departed. Farewells to the hosts had to be brief so as not to create a crowd at the exit from the hall. The day after the ball, every guest was required to send a thank you card. This complex whirlwind of dances, bows, and visits never stopped. The architecture of Victorian mansions reflected the strict social norms of the time. The space of the house was clearly divided into male and female territories with different functions and designs. This division helped reinforce gender roles and provided the necessary privacy for various activities. Moving from one zone to another was often accompanied by a change in manners, tone of voice, and even posture. The interiors of the rooms literally dictated to people how they should behave at that moment. The living room, or reception room, was considered the undisputed domain of female influence. The design of this room was always executed in light, pastel tones with an abundance of floral motifs. The furniture in the living room was light, elegant, and upholstered in silk or fine velvet. It was here that the ladies spent their mornings embroidering, reading light literature, or playing music. Guests were also invited here for short daytime visits and tea parties. Men were allowed into the living room only by invitation or during formal receptions. While in this women's domain, gentlemen were required to exercise particular tact in their speech and behavior. They sat on the edges of the soft armchairs, taking care not to crease the lace doilies on the armrests. Conversations in this room were conducted in hushed tones on abstract and pleasant topics. The living room served as a showcase of family well-being and the hostess's impeccable taste. The billiard room and smoking room were the complete opposite of the bright living room. These were strictly masculine spaces, hidden from women's eyes deep within the house. The interiors were dominated by dark colors, massive oak paneling, and heavy leather furniture. The scent of fine cigars and strong tobacco permeated the thick woolen carpets on the floor. Here, gentlemen could relax, loosen their collars, and engage in candid conversation. Women were categorically and strictly forbidden from entering these male sanctuaries. The appearance of a lady in the billiard room during a men's game was considered an unthinkable breach of propriety. In these rooms, political news, financial deals, and topics deemed inappropriate in mixed company were discussed. Men could afford to adopt more relaxed postures, laugh loudly, and use professional jargon. It was a place of respite from the rigid constraints of social etiquette. The library occupied an intermediate position in this gender geography of the home. Formerly, it was considered the master's study, a place for serious work and business meetings. Tall bookshelves reaching the ceiling and a massive writing desk created an atmosphere of academic rigor. However, ladies were permitted to visit the library at certain hours to select books. During this time, the room became a neutral zone requiring silence and academic tranquility. The dining room served as the main venue for the coexistence of both sexes. As mentioned earlier, the most complex rules governing interaction between men and women were in effect here. The room's layout centered around a massive table, which served as a physical barrier between people seated across from one another. Heavy drapes on the windows and the subdued light of candles created a solemn and somewhat oppressive atmosphere. No one could feel completely at ease in this room. The process of separating the sexes after dinner clearly demonstrated this architectural segregation. The ladies would rise and, in an orderly group, leave the dining room, heading to their bright drawing room. The men remained at the table, pulled their chairs closer to the host, and took out their cigarette cases. This physical separation could last about an hour, during which each gender remained in its own sphere. Only then did the men join the ladies for the final tea party. Even the hallways and staircases in large houses were often designed with the separation of people's paths in mind. There were grand staircases for guests and hosts, as well as hidden narrow passageways for the servants. The intersection of these paths was kept to a minimum so as not to disrupt the illusion of perfect order. Servants appeared as if out of nowhere only when necessary and disappeared just as quickly. The house functioned like a complex clockwork mechanism with invisible gears. This architectural system reinforced social norms on a physical level. From birth, people grew accustomed to the idea that every action had its proper place. Crossing the boundaries of these zones caused deep inner discomfort in a Victorian-era person. Space governed people just as strictly as the rules of etiquette. One of the rules most difficult for modern sensibilities to grasp was the control of sound volume. In respectable society, absolute, almost eerie silence and restraint were valued. Loud voices, the sharp sound of footsteps, or ringing laughter were considered signs of plebeian origins. The ideal gentleman or lady was expected to move through space smoothly and almost silently. The entire life of the upper class unfolded in hushed tones and half-whispers. Suppressing the body's natural reactions required immense inner discipline. Coughing, sneezing, or breathing loudly in public was forbidden by the rules of propriety. If a person felt unwell, they were obliged to leave the room immediately so as not to disturb the general silence. Suppressing laughter was also an important skill for a person of high society. A slight, barely noticeable smile was the only acceptable way to show joy or merriment. The rule of silence also applied to the handling of household objects. Doors in homes had to open and close without the slightest creak or knock. Chairs should be moved across the floor smoothly, lifting them to avoid making any scraping sounds. Placing a teacup on a porcelain saucer was done with surgical precision and absolute silence. The clinking of dishes betrayed a person's nervousness or their inability to control their movements. Communication with servants also took place with minimal sound. Shouting at the staff or giving orders in a loud voice was considered the height of bad manners. To summon a footman, special velvet cords with bells, hidden in the corridors, were used. Many instructions were given through barely perceptible gestures, glances, or slight nods of the head. The ideal servant was expected to anticipate his master's wishes even before they were voiced. Out on the street, control over the volume of one's voice became even stricter. Conversations on the sidewalk were conducted in such a way that people walking just a few steps away could not hear a thing. Calling out to an acquaintance from across the street was absolutely unthinkable and scandalous. If one needed to get a person's attention, one had to approach them closely and speak in a quiet voice. The noise of the street consisted of the clatter of hooves and the creak of wheels, but not of human shouts. Expressions of surprise or fear were also subject to strict internal censorship. Upon seeing something unusual or frightening, a true aristocrat was expected to maintain a dispassionate expression. Waving one's hands, gasping, or changing one's tone of voice was considered a loss of face and dignity. This emotional armor protected people from unwanted attention and demonstrated complete self-control. A person was expected to look as though nothing in the world could throw them off balance. The cultivation of this silence began in the earliest years under the supervision of governesses. People were taught to walk by placing their foot from toe to heel to minimize the clacking of heels on the parquet floor. They were forced to sit motionless for hours, without making a sound or changing their posture. Reading aloud was practiced only in an even, monotonous voice, without theatrical inflections. As a result, a generation of people was formed who were capable of existing in a state of absolute social silence. This silence was not a sign of calm, it was the result of immense tension. Behind the outward facade of silence lay complex intrigues, fears, and unspoken grievances. People were forced to seek other, nonverbal ways to express their true feelings and emotions. This is precisely why the languages of fans, calling cards, and flowers took on such immense significance. Unable to speak aloud, society created an extremely complex system of silent symbols. The atmosphere of public silence shaped the unique psychological climate of the era. People constantly watched themselves and those around them, afraid of disrupting this fragile acoustic balance. This strict discipline created the illusion of an ideal, orderly world where everything was under control. The absence of noise was equated with the absence of problems and social upheaval. What other historical topics would you like to see in our next videos? Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos.